Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Cambridge Union. Our debate this evening is this House regrets social media as the primary source of news distribution. In a world of fake versus real news, this debate is more current than ever. Indeed, as we move to a point now where the President of the United States is combating not only news within his own country, but news around the world in terms of the presentation of his administration. We're incredibly delighted this evening to welcome a variety of speakers, not only from the world of real news, but from the world of parody news, potentially the most polite way to describe it, to speak in this debate and to comment on these issues. And if somebody in the audience could pass me an order paper, that would be fantastic, as I have no idea in what order anybody's speaking, as my chair was not prepared for this debate. Thank you. Take your seat now. So on the motion that this House regrets the rise of social media as the primary means of news distribution, I would like to call, I think, Joe to speak first? No, Katie Balls to speak first. Katie is the political correspondent for The Spectator and is the winner of the Hunter Davies Journalism Prize. Katie.
Okay. Donald Trump endorsed by the Pope. Theresa May is a lizard in disguise. Hillary Clinton facilitates a paedophilia ring based in a pizza restaurant. That is, when she's not busy selling arms to ISIS. Now, what do these stories have in common? They're fake. And how have they come to be? Through the internet and distributed through social media. Granted, fake news is nothing new. The deliberate spread of false information for political gain has been around for as long as politics. It's often known as propaganda. If you're looking for a dirty campaign, forget Hillary v. Trump and go back to the 19th century. In 1828, Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, Jackson's supporters spread a rumor around that Adams and his wife had offered up the sexual services of a young American girl to the Tsar of Russia. It got so out of hand that it had to be addressed on the floor of the House. So, what's new? What's the big deal? Well, the sheer scale. A Stanford study found that fabricated stories in the US election, which favored Donald Trump, were shared a total of 30 million times. Thanks to social media, fake news can spread, travel, and multiply like never before. And you can also monetize it, which offers an extra incentive. But does anyone actually believe these stories? Is it such a problem? The ones I mentioned before seem quite obviously fake. But it's not always so obvious. A second study from Stanford found that the students they surveyed showed a dismaying lack of ability to tell the difference between fake news and real news. It seems that a blue tick on Twitter is sometimes just not enough. To be fair to them, I get confused too. As The Spectator's political correspondent, it's my job to stay on top of the news stories of the day. But I have been led up the garden path many a time on Twitter. There was a time that Jeremy Corbyn skipped the VIP lunch of war veterans to hang out with, normal people. Spoiler, there was no VIP lunch. Then there's a meme that goes viral on social media every couple of months. And it's a photo. It shows two pictures of the House of Commons Chamber of Parliament. And in one picture, is an empty chamber. And the second is packed to the rafters. Now, the empty one purports to show MPs voting on something like, disability cuts, and the one that's full is MPs voting on a pay rise for themselves. But it's not true. If you actually look at the days these were supposed to happen, they don't correlate. And one shows a picture of the old chamber, which kind of gives the game away. Now, my colleague exposed this and wrote a piece explaining that, it's wrong. But it's very hard to stamp it out because it lives on social media. So you can't let everyone know that what they're retweeting is a false thing. And for a lot of people, it kind of fits in with their narrative already of politicians as corrupt. Now, the election study I mentioned earlier concluded that fake news might not be such a problem because it probably didn't actually affect the election result. Now, I hope this is because readers who want to hear about Hillary and the pizza restaurant were probably not about to vote for her anyway. But for me, and I hope you, this doesn't mean it's not a problem. Even if just, say, 5,000 people go around really thinking Hillary is part of a paedophilia ring and the Democratic Party still chose her as a candidate, that's just bad. That's bad for society. it's bad for political discourse, and it's bad because it creates mistrust over something where there is no problem. And that leads me to my second point as to why this House ought to regret the rise of social media as a primary means of news distribution. Using social media often perpetuates echo chambers, where you only really hear one point of view, and often one that isn't 100% attached to reality. What's more, if on Facebook, you're friends and you have similar interests, and you have similar views, then the way that Facebook works is it will recommend stories that already fit with your views, things that fit with your politics, so you're very unlikely to hear an opposing point of view. I think that's part of the reason we saw when young people were so shocked at the Brexit result. A lot of my friends were just like, well, I don't know one person who supports Brexit. And it was partly because they were all looking at each other's statuses. Now, a BuzzFeed investigation found that in the first 2 weeks of the current UK general election campaign, articles by alt-left publications were shared more on Facebook than articles by the MSM or the mainstream media. And we also know that alt-right sites like Breitbart do very well on Facebook. Now, you could argue that this is a good thing because it brings more points of view and more alternative views. And actually, perhaps the mainstream media have a slight right-wing bias, so left-wing opinions balance that out. I mean, or as Paul Mason puts it, us mainstream media hacks who are utterly subservient to a bunch of right-wing, reactionary, misogynistic, racist bottoms. Not the words I would use. But while papers may have an institutional bias to some of its readers, first and foremost, journalists work to get their facts right, and they're held to account when they fail. If we get our facts wrong, we can be fined, we can be sued, we can face IPSO, we might have to do a correction, and we could also go to criminal court. Now, Thomas Clark, he's of Another Angry Voice blog, one of these alt-left sites, and he puts his blog's success down to the fact that when you follow something like The Guardian or The Mirror, 1 minute they're posting all this stuff which is good and it holds the Tories to account, and the next they're posting anti-Corbyn stuff. He says his blog just isn't as cognitive dissonance-inducing because people know the stuff he's likely to do. But as far as I'm concerned, the job of news is to tell you what's actually happening, not what you want to hear. But this is the thing about social media. It perpetuates this echo chamber where you mainly hear one side and you're less likely to engage in the other side of the argument. Now, that's unhealthy. We need to hear other points of view, read and accept them, even if you still decide you're right. You need to learn how to negotiate and compromise or explain your point of view to other people without getting irate. In conclusion, I like social media. I use it regularly, and I do think it should play a role in journalism. But a balance must be struck. The motion is not should social media be a means of news distribution. It's whether it should be the primary means. I'm not suggesting we go back 20 years, turn off the internet router, and all take out print subscriptions. Technology has moved on. Yes, use Twitter and Facebook, but also speak to people, get out there, read things that challenge you, and take it upon yourself to educate yourself and step outside of your comfort zone. There's a reason that every day the newspapers don't share the same front page. It's called a free press, and that has an important place in a free society. You don't live in a propaganda state, so why would you make one for yourself online?
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech and move now to the first speaker for the opposition, Carol Walker, the former political news correspondent with the BBC. Walker was one of the longest-serving reporters at the organisation, having covered Westminster since 1997. Carol.
Thank you. Well, we heard a very eloquent description there of the dangers which arise when the masses can access and influence the news through social media. And here's a quote for you. "The world is overwhelmed with data that's confusing and harmful." Well, that was the Swiss scientist Konrad Gessner speaking in the 16th century, and he was talking about the printing press. Here's another warning on how the media could be abused by demagogues, by appeals to emotion and prejudice and ignorance. Well, that was Senator John F. Kennedy speaking in 1959, and he was talking about television news. Incidentally, he did go on to say that he thought that the net effect could definitely be for the better, and obviously I agree with that. My central argument is that for all its faults, which we've just heard about, I believe that social media is now an important part of our democracy. It allows more people than ever before to access and engage with news, information, and comment. It gives them a new tool to challenge those in authority and to expose wrongdoing or corruption. We live in the age of the internet, and it's simply pointless to argue that things were so much better when there were fewer sources of news. It's part of our daily lives. I have two well-informed, politically aware offspring, one of whom graduated from this university a couple of years ago. And I can just imagine what the reaction would be if I suggested to them, well, if they really want to know what's going on, just read the Telegraph in the morning, or the Guardian, because then you'll get an alternative viewpoint, and then you can just wait and listen to the 6 o'clock news in the evening. Let's get real. That doesn't match what our lives are like now. Yes, fake news is a problem, but, as you pointed out, it's not new. It may spread more quickly on social media, but it existed long before the first computers. Here's a headline: Freddie Starr ate my hamster. That was a famous headline, which some of you may remember, in The Sun in 1986. Completely untrue, of course, but the publicist Max Clifford allowed it to run because he thought it was all good publicity for the up-and-coming tour. Mind you, some would argue that was the least of his crimes. Let's take a more serious example, the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, in which 96 football fans died. There was another famous Sun headline entitled "The Truth." It claimed that Liverpool fans were drunk, picked the pockets of victims, punched and kicked police officers, and urinated on the injured and dying. It took 26 years for the truth to emerge, that the fans were blameless, those who died were unlawfully killed, and the police commander at the time was responsible for manslaughter by gross negligence. If, God forbid, such a disaster were to occur today, thousands of fans would be armed with mobile phones. Images would have been circulating on social media within minutes. The fake news, which blackened the names of so many for so long, would simply not have had any credibility. Look what happened on United Airlines when they dragged the passenger kicking and screaming off the flight. The video spread rapidly on social media. The behavior of United Airlines was exposed, and the company has been forced to change its policy on overbooking. Some of the first and most powerful images of the recent chemical attack in Syria emerged on social media. It's a vital means of communication for oppressed citizens living under repressive regimes. Why else would North Korea try to ban Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as it did last month? It was clearly a desperate attempt to stifle any word of criticism of a tyrannical regime. Now, I've worked for most of my life for that dreaded mainstream media. And I know that organisations like the BBC were perhaps slow to realise the significance of social media. But it's now a vital part of the way they gather their news. The BBC has a whole unit dedicated to user-generated content, UGC. When big stories happen, it's often eyewitnesses there on the ground who have got the best pictures, who can provide accounts of what they saw or heard. It doesn't change the need for good journalism. We still have to verify what they're saying, and the BBC goes to great lengths to try to do this. But it gives people a chance to get involved, to ensure that what they are seeing there on the ground gets out. It gives people the chance to get an inside track on what's happening. Before, only a very privileged few of us had access to the House of Commons lobby with a special pass, so you could talk to MPs and have a chat with them. Now, go onto Twitter. You'll get an invaluable insight into what many of them are thinking, and often the first indication of a growing row or gaffe. I'm not here just to defend my former employers. It's clear that social media gives a platform to views and voices which are not reflected on the mainstream media, as you talked about. Many of you here may not quite like those sites such as Breitbart, which did so much to help Donald Trump's campaign. But you can't deny that it tapped into a public mood. And there is this other new breed. I'm surprised to hear the New Statesman criticising sites like Another Angry Voice, The Canary, which reach millions of readers a week and challenge the views of the mainstream media, particularly when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn. Surely in our modern democracy, it's right to have a space for a real diversity of views. People don't want to rely on the filter of the big broadcasters and the newspapers, and who are we to restrict the information and the opinions that they read? There's a spreadsheet circulating on social media which allows voters to find out whom they should vote for if they want to stop the Tories. Now, that may or may not match your political views, but surely voters should have accurate information on how to vote tactically if that is what they want to do. And it's also much more imaginative and fun. My son, who's studying politics at university, sends me all those wonderful political memes, and they are genuinely funny. They can be brutal, subversive, but they do prick holes in the world of the slogans and sound bites. So let's not wallow in this lazy, rose-tinted nostalgia about how much better it all was when there was a small group of old editors and fat executives controlling the news that we consume. Let's, yes, challenge those who are bigoted, the scaremongers who are peddling fake news, but make sure that social media is a place for a wider exchange of views on politics, on academia, on science. Let's make the most of it to challenge the powerful elites, expose corruption, and engage in the rich seam of ideas from people who've got no time for the tired traditional media.
I would like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and move now to a round of floor speeches. So does anybody in the chamber have a speech in proposition of the motion that they would like to give? Yeah, down there, Gabriel.
I think the vital point that was made in the first speech there is the accountability aspect of this. If there is accurate information going about on social media, that is obviously a terrific thing. But when there's inaccurate information, you people in the journalistic world can be held to account. You can't hold Thomas Clark to account because he's not a full-time journalist. You can't get him unemployed as a maths teacher for saying things which are untrue on the internet. There's no means of making sure that people can't publicise things which are blatantly false, or if they do, there's a chance that they can be held to account. Now, IPSA might be fairly toothless, but I think it would be wrong to imagine there aren't times when some people considered briefly whether they might be prosecuted by them before they wrote an article and then rephrased it in a way that was less deceptive. I think we also have to understand that the rise of fake news isn't only on social media. An accurate point has been made. I believe a study was done demonstrating the fact the reason fake news has not become prominent in the UK is because the tabloids already do that job for us, and it's not been possible for these websites to gain such a big marketplace as they have in the US. But it remains the case that just by saying social media particularly provides fake news, doesn't mean we're to condone the fake news in other parts of the media. We can hold that social media is a place where fake news is prevalent, and also at the same time go, and we also ought to hold better to account all the tabloids who are spewing out the same rubbish. So I think the key point in this debate is about accountability. Social media can provide positivity, but we have no means as yet of making it accountable for when it doesn't.
I would like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and ask now if anybody has a speech in opposition of this motion. Andrea, or Hannah, actually, that was down there.
So I kind of basically just wanted to argue against that point of accountability. I think that in some circumstances, social media can actually provide the biggest part of accountability rather than some articles based in like the tabloid press do. For example, I read an article about a month ago based on the testimony of one text message about Tom Daley cheating on his now husband in everyone's favourite paper, The Sun. Whereas if people are consistently tweeting about an event as it happens, if you have 10, 20, 100, 1,000 people tweeting about an event as it happens, they can generate an event and they can see that, like, they can let journalists see that this news is happening and draw attention to an event and provide general accountability, as opposed to building a story on the testimony of one text message, as in the, like, that one example. But that is the gist of the tabloid press. Sometimes they get one piece of information and elaborate it to beyond any extent, whereas with social media, if you have so many people talking about one particular event, it can provide a major part of validation for it.
Thank you so much. And a speech in abstention of that motion. Yes, over there.
James Woodhouse, Jesus College. I think the thing that would decide this debate for me was if the proposition would suggest one thing that the mainstream media has over and above social media as a platform and provider of news, and not just accountability issues, something that makes it more reliable, more incisive, I would say, and perhaps more accessible. Thank you.
I would like to thank that speaker for their speech and move now to the second speaker in proposition of the motion, Alex Krasodomski-Jones, a researcher at the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos. Krasodomski-Jones focuses his research on political extremism and its reportage in social media. Alex.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. This is a real honour. To understand why social media has been damaging to news, you have to, I think, look beyond the headlines. Look beyond the websites, look beyond even the lines of code that pipe it directly into our eyeballs. You have to, I think, look at how and why content exists on the internet. Take it at its most basic. What is news? The question that I ask myself is, what is news? Facebook's main page is called a news feed. Twitter has rebranded itself now as a news site. Two of the biggest platforms where people, especially young people, get their news, display that news reporting in exactly the same place as they do their comment pieces, their hot takes, their paid advertising, and the photos from your secondary school mate's second wedding. Mixing all this together and lumping it under the category of news is profoundly misleading, and the your mates bit is really important. We're now past news stories, not by newspapers, but by our friends on social media, who paradoxically, if you believe Ipsos Mori polling, we trust our friends a lot more than we trust journalists, even though journalists are much more likely to fact check than to be held accountable for what they write. Facebook has wrenched editorial control over our news away from media organizations and into the hands of whoever, Ian, who you met on a beach in Spain in 2010, and who now keeps you up to date on the government's projects to spray us with mind control drugs from planes. And what makes news important has completely changed too. Perhaps in the past, the bygone years that we heard about, we might have measured the value of a piece of news by where it lands on the paper. Is it on the front page? Is it on page 6? Which paper has even published it? Who has written it? Is it a reputable journalist, or is it Ian? Now, the currency of news is shares and likes and comments. It's popularity or infamy. An important story is one that's shared a lot. And in this currency of interactions, of comments, of likes, we're all on a level. If it's the FT, it's The Guardian, it's Breitbart, it's InfoWars, Ian. I haven't written into this at all. I don't know where he's come from. Yes, that's right. It doesn't matter who's provided the source. Everything is measured in the same currency. And a story that isn't important might as well not exist. Nobody clicks it. It generates no ad revenue. And the writer, which is speaking from personal experience, is then dragged in by their boss to talk about, quote, digital marketing strategies, 360-degree clickability, and curated ideation. Now, in the attention economy, which is so fundamental to understanding everything that happens on the web, including social media and news, in the attention economy, so cutthroat, so competitive, content exists if people interact with it. Whether it's true, whether it's even been fact-checked, whether the journalist, the researcher is any good, or even what the source is, none of that matters. News and comment, fact or fiction, satire and lies, they're all blended together and dumped on our phones under the guise of news. It's troubling. And with the advent, and it's also profoundly depressing, with the advent of the web, we were promised a marketplace of ideas, but we've ended up with a strange conspiratorial coliseum of facts and alternative facts, where conflict is inevitable, but actually fighting or winning an argument is impossible. The web sustains as many ecosystems of knowledge as there are people who want to believe them, and they live comfortably side by side, untroubled by their opposition. For me, the question is, what now? What do we do in a media environment that financially incentivizes the sending of poor facts to people who want to believe them?
I'd like to thank Alex very much for his speech and invite now Paul Stokes to continue the case for the opposition. Paul is the creator of the Daily Mash, the satirical news website, and is also the former business editor of The Scotsman. Paul.
So I'm basically here as a purveyor of fake news, I suppose, but I'd say ours is like genuine fake news, which is opposed to the new breed of fake news, which is giving us a bad name. So I've had the dubious pleasure of earning my living on the internet for 10 years now, and before that, for 20 years, I was a newspaper journalist. I've seen the industry that I worked in and love decimated. But I don't actually blame social media for that, and I actually think without it, it might even be worse. When we set up the Facebook page for the Daily Mash in the kind of Klondike era, I suppose, of the internet a few years ago, we put on it as an introduction to the audience, the new audience who were coming to it. It said, "Welcome to our free marketing tool. We have no interest in your worthless, ill-informed opinions." We've now got 600,000 people following us on that page. I mean, and I don't know if you've ever tried to read the internet, but it's big, and you really should not ever try to print it out. That's a bad idea. And what Facebook offers us as a very, very small publishing outfit, new entrance into the market, is a way to cut through all the noise and get our content out there on a weekly basis. Our posts can be seen by 10 million people across a little mobile phone screen, but that's only ready if we deserve it. A couple of months ago, we ran a story on the proposed state visit of Donald Trump to the UK, headlined, "Legally, I Can Kill Him, Confirmed Queen." Now, it's quoting Her Majesty directly, and it recounted how Palace staff had advised her that, according to English law, as sovereign, if she judged Trump to be damaging the monarchy, she could dispatch him with her sword without any repercussion. "Just imagine the look on his Satsuma face," she said. Now, that was read by 10 million people in 2 days. And although it's fake, it is actually based on a reading of the law. There is a kind of a genuine basis, as there always is in our stories. That's like a month's traffic for us in 2 days. The day after the Donald Trump's election, we ran a story saying, "Relieved Britain, no longer biggest F-up of 2016," which is read by 1 million people in a day. Now, the Queen story, 90% of those readers came from Facebook. The Trump story, 70% came from Facebook. Now, I actually despise Facebook and social media in general as much as all kind of right-thinking people should. Encourages narcissism, diminished attention spans. Facebook has monopoly power, but social media is not really the main cause of the problems in the news industry. As people have said already, it didn't create fake news. I've got one more example, which I have to get in, which is, of course, Boris Johnson, our current Foreign Secretary, as the Daily Telegraph's core in Brussels in the 90s, invented the Euro scare story, falsely reporting that Europe was going to bring in standardized condoms and also ban prawn cocktail crisps. Fake news, social media has made it easier to spread fake news, but there are limits. The Donald Trump story, which I think Katie referred to earlier on, is like Donald Trump, endorsed by Pope Francis, was the most shared story on Facebook during the elections. But that's just one story. And you have to remember that every real story will be covered by a multiplicity of news organizations. And those stories will also be widely shared. And they will outnumber the reach of the fake news story. And there was research after the US elections, and they found that people could only actually recall one fake news story from the whole thing. And again, this thing where they couldn't tell real news from fake news, they also couldn't tell fake news from fake news, because they made up other fake news to try and to test that thing. The other limits, if you look in France, what happened last week, it's a huge social dump of information onto the internet on the Friday, smearing Emmanuel Macron. The French just shrugged, pretended they couldn't understand English, and just ignored it. Probably it was outside of the regulation 35-hour limit they have for political argument in that country, as we know. And even now, TV is still the main source of news for every age group in Britain, according to Reuters, apart from the 18 to 24-year-olds. So maybe social media isn't the main source of distribution of news at all. As other people said earlier on, social media has enlivened the news scene. There's new voices, such as ourselves, and BuzzFeed, which has gone from a purveyor of terrible listicles into one of the biggest investors in investigative journalism in Britain. It's also, I think, invigorated many existing old publications, such as The Spectator, which is on a huge rise on the back of social media. And why it may not look like it, but Facebook does actually favor quality, I believe. It promotes stories that are read and shared, and most of those are shared because people actually do value them. It demotes stories that are read and then disappoint, which is the definition of clickbait. I also think that, despite what everyone's saying, fake news is actually pretty easy to spot if you're reasonably intelligent and you know how to read the news. I mean, it does thrive on the internet, but there are a lot of stupid people on the internet, I'm afraid. Our Queen story did actually flip over from genuine fake news, which is what we normally do, into fake news. We were fact-checked by Snopes. I was interviewed by BuzzFeed saying, did I feel responsible for this? I say, I can't be held responsible for the stupidity of people on the internet. And I said, if you believe this kind of story, you should go to an island and don't breed. Now, social media is not creating gullibility or stupidity. Those things are out there. If there is a problem with the news, some of it is down to the news providers who have devalued their own currency, as Alex pointed out. But also, a lot of it is down to the readers. You've got to, who creates your news feed? Who puts these things on? Who puts these things on there? You yourself select all these sources, I think. And so, I mean, going back to my original point, social media is a tool, it's not a master. So from social media, you get the news you want, how you want it. I mean, social media is delivering it, but after that, I think it plays the limited part.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech and now ask for another round of floor speeches. So does anybody have a speech in proposition of the motion?
It's probably fair enough that people's stupidity is an independent factor that's problematic. But when we have a specific platform which enhances not just the tendency but the impact of stupidity, it probably seems that that's something we ought to regret. Not just if it exists, but when it does seem to be taking over as the main form of distribution and the main way a large number of people, admittedly young people, but still people nonetheless, are consuming news. That's something that probably is problematic and might be regretted, even if it's not necessarily something we'd actively want to ban.
Guangru from Queen's College. I'm from China, but from this debate, I think most debate is on accountabilities of the people post on the social media. But to my impression, in the Western world, people have the freedom to post on the social media whatever they think the story is. But in my country, it's on the other end of the story because the government put a lot of responsibility to control the mediums and the people who post the fake stories, and there is a crime in the law, disturb the published orders, and so you could be arrested or detained if you published something that disturbed the published order. I wonder if in the Western world there are something similar like this, or there is maybe some lessons learned from Eastern and implies to Western world.
And with that differentiation between real fake news, and fake news that allows you to understand that it's fake, but also real at the same time, I think we'll move to our last pair of speeches. So speaking for the proposition and their final speaker, we have Joe Fullman, the Vice President of Marketing for The Onion. Fullman manages the main social media aspects of that company. Mr. Fullman.
So I am here today in support of this proposition, despite the fact that I owe my livelihood to distributing news and social media. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for the world's most popular satirical newspaper, America's finest news source, The Onion, and its sister brands, Clickhole and the AV Club. In that role, I lead a team of 5 marketers who are primarily engaged with social content distribution. That said, we distribute content in a number of other ways. We distribute content in every way that is available to us. I can only, I should say before I get into this, really speak to the context of distributing news in the United States, and really distributing mostly fake news in the United States. And I would say, but before I jump in, that there is a kernel of truth in satire. There is something that is very real and sort of eternal about something that makes a headline that's based on the news, both funny and makes you stop and think and interpret the news in a way that you might not if you were just reading straight news. But now that huge disclaimer is out of the way, I will jump into the meat of my argument. And the biggest and most important reason that social media's role as the primary means of news distribution is deleterious to society is that it's the primary means of distributing news, right? We're not debating whether social media should exist in the world, because really that is a meaningless debate. Social media has always existed in some form. It exists in a certain context now. But the question is, should we have some kind of gatekeeper between us and the news? And the lack of accountability is an important point that's been brought up a number of times. The role of the editor is I think kind of the key thing that we're talking about here. There are still reporters, right? There are still reporters who are independent, who are reporting through social media. No one is impugning the work they do. No one is saying that it does not have some value. The question is, who should decide what is the most important story of the day? Should it be a writer? Should it be an editor? Should it be your friend Ian from the beach, right? The question is, how should we be thinking about what goes in the top left box on the homepage of theonion.com? And that should really be the story that we think is most important from the editor's point of view, not from the marketer's point of view, and not from the world of social media. Because ultimately, what is popular may not be the most important thing for us to be talking about. Now, this argument is somewhat paternalistic, and there are few other institutions that have a remit to play this role in society. So the question is, if we are not paternalistic about how news is distributed, then who is going to be that alternative arbiter? Is it going to be an algorithm? And I think the question of should it be an algorithm is really what we're talking about here. Should it be Facebook counting likes, counting shares, looking at the velocity of shares, and deciding based on that this is credible, that this is important, until it reaches some threshold where they say, okay, let's do a fact check, which is a new thing, very recent thing, and decide, is this real, or should we put a little warning on top of it? And that is a good thing, I would say, that generally that there is some stopgap measure, but there's even something a little bit off about that too, right? Do we really want to have an somewhat unaccountable journalism student somewhere in America, most likely, deciding what is real and fake news on behalf of Facebook, or on behalf of Twitter, or on behalf of Google? But I am not a journalist, and this is not the primary argument that I'll make. I'll say it's the most important argument that should be made about this from the side of the proposition, and it's been made well already tonight. But my argument is essentially an economic argument. So to level set, it's news to no one to point out that we're in an age of rapid transformation in the news distribution industry. My company launched as a print publication in 1988 in the teeming metropolis of Madison, Wisconsin, a sleepy university town in the American Midwest. We, over the first 5 years of our existence, grew and grew, and launched in 1996 our first website. A few months later, a little startup out of New York City called the New York Times launched their own competing website. We've both found space in the world. But for the first decade of its existence, our website was really not that important to the business of running our enterprise, right? It was not feeding writers. It was just something that we put out there in the world. And that was because during 1996 to about 2006, our company was expanding in print rapidly. Over 30 editions at its peak in big cities across the United States and Canada. And at a certain point in time, the website overtook our print publication in terms of visitors and in terms of page views and all of the metrics that matter to advertisers. But the advertisers weren't ready to buy that yet. What really changed that was two factors that really came in around 2005, 2006. So the first factor was social media sites like MySpace, Facebook, Twitter launched during that period. And at first we didn't think too much of them. We launched on all of those platforms. We will launch on any new platform that comes out there. Our early success in the web was based on being a first mover before the New York Times, before a lot of other newspapers were on the internet, before a lot of humor publishers were on the internet. And we took that same philosophy into every channel that we've entered. And we will, as I said, continue to enter them. But a lot of what has changed is from the second factor. The second thing that happened in 2005, 2006 was the launch of news aggregators like Digg, Reddit, and Google News, who burst onto the scene and helped boost overall online news consumption considerably. And it really boosted awareness of these publications being online and available for free. Some of these news aggregators also introduced something that the early social networks didn't immediately have, notably Facebook, the socially curated feeds of content from news publishers. In this regard, really it's Digg who we have to blame for all of this, because they were the innovators who gave that stamp of social credibility to content. And these new socially curated feeds produced massive spikes of traffic for us and other publishers around single stories in a single day, as you pointed out. In recent history, we've both had a lot of success from one big story hitting that day. For a publication, that's actually not necessarily a great thing. If we go to fill from programmatic ad inventory, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's an important point. We make a lot less money when one story hits really, really hard and heavy than we do when we have loyal readers come back every day and enter in through the homepage. If you come and read one story on our site, but you enter through the homepage, you're worth twice as much as somebody who came in from social media, read one story, and left. So if we think about this as an economic argument, we need to think not of the responsibility of social networks or of journalistic institutions, but of all of us to produce the kind of news market that we want to see in the world. Beyond the accountability to be good gatekeepers of information, it's the accountability for us to have probably 2, at least, newspaper subscriptions that we pay for. Because if you trust the information that comes from 2 newspapers, then you can independently verify yourself between those 2 sources. You are paid up, you are invested in them, and you have a reason to believe what they tell you. And that is something that has really disappeared in the generation that I am in, and many of you in this room are, right? Only 5% of Americans 18 to 29 get news often from a print newspaper, and about half, 48%, of those 65 and older get their news from a print newspaper. Again, United States, Pew Research. So supporting the edifice of a news organization is really what's at stake here when we talk about social media. Because it is the important things that a newspaper does that we really need to be thinking about. It's investigative journalism. It's the city desk. It's the things that don't make any money that are only possible when we take responsibility and do not just sort of graze what's available to us on social media. It's not to say that there's not an important function of social discovery, but that function of social discovery is only a piece of what a well-rounded news diet looks like. So, all of that said, it would be incorrect to say that we have not benefited greatly from our partnerships with social media platforms. I oftentimes feel like I'm the inside salesman for Twitter and Facebook inside of my organization, trying to get us involved in new programs. Because in my role in audience development, it's important that we are involved in all of these things. But the question is, and why it's so important that I'm not the sole decision maker, is there's an opportunity cost, right? There's an opportunity cost for us to think, should we invest in Facebook video? Should we invest in news cards for Twitter? Should we invest in all of these new programs that are available to large publishers? Or should we focus on the things that are editorial priorities? And that is ultimately what's at stake. So if we think that fake news is, a symptom rather than a problem, the solution to it is really being involved, right? Being involved and having a stake in our sources of information. So to sort of sum up this argument, the asymmetry of the economics is the central issue at stake. Whether you're a smaller publisher or a larger publisher, you face a lot of the same pressures because no matter how big you are, you're not as big as Facebook and Twitter. You'll never have any marketplace power with them. They will always be able to dictate terms to you. And if this is the world we want to live in, then we're going to have to deal with fake news. We're going to have to deal with news that doesn't conform to our values. We're going to have to deal with whatever's put in front of us. Because at the end of the day, the sad truth is the amount of time that, Americans, again, my facts are all about Americans. We are probably the laziest of the bunch. So we are probably victim to a lot of these things more than other news markets. But we now spend 50 minutes a day on Facebook sites alone. 50 minutes a day. That is starting to, It is starting to come up against how much time we spend watching TV almost. And for every hour that we are on Facebook, Facebook is now making 158% more than they were 3 years ago from the advertising. So their incentive is just to keep us in platform. So whether they tell us that fake news is being weeded out or fake news is being taken care of, their goal is not to produce a front page. Their goal is to keep us in the platform for 10 more minutes next year than they did this year. And that is ultimately negative. And from the standpoint of journalistic organizations, this puts more and more pressure on news publishers to do one of two things. Either to go the blog route and create hot takes, more sensationalistic blog-like content that can drive clicks with salacious headlines, or to consolidate into ever larger media companies that can create feeds of our own content to keep users on our own sites longer as soon as they get in, right? So to try to send somebody from one site to another site, to another site, to another site, all owned by the same publisher. That's in some ways just as bad as, as Facebook, as Twitter, as anything else, because it will still be driven by someone other than an editor. And both of these things are ultimately negative for society and produce the conditions that allow fake news to exist. And that's all I have to say.
I would like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and move now to the final speaker for the opposition side in this debate, Sarah Baxter, the deputy editor of the Sunday Times. Sarah is a graduate of St Hilda's, Oxford, well, I guess we can't all be perfect, and a former Washington correspondent. Sarah.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm thrilled to have my friend from The Onion, from the opposing side, celebrate the role of the editor, because that is my job. I do decide what to put on the front page of the Sunday Times very often. I do decide what's at the top, what's at the bottom, what goes at the back, what's at the front. And believe you me, we've got every bit at the front of our mind the same thing that Facebook has. How do we persuade people to spend 10 more minutes reading this? We're always thinking, what do the readers want? What will entertain them? What will inform them? And what they want from the Sunday Times is, we know it's a bit of everything, isn't it? It's fun, bits of humor, it's bits of fashion, it's style, it's culture, it's what's on telly, and it's big insight investigations, it's the toppling of FIFA, a big global story that was all the bigger for being shared on social networks. So I'd actually like to draw on my experience as deputy editor of the Sunday Times to argue that social media is a very good thing, and I don't mind in the least that a lot of news is disseminated through social media. Now, I want to take you back to the year 1998. There was an unknown guy, a bit of an internet nerd, and fledgling news aggregator called Matt Drudge, and he unleashed on the world the biggest news story of that year, the biggest news story of the decade almost. And it was too hot for Newsweek, a mainstream publication, to publish, or they felt it was too hot. It was their mistake. This story was 23-year-old intern has sexual relations with president. And it hit like a bombshell. And of course, this was a very, very juicy apple with a little worm in it. Everybody read about it. Monica Lewinsky, for it was her that I'm talking about, later said, quite shrewdly, I think, that she was perhaps the first ever victim of cyberbullying. She was still a very young woman. And Bill Clinton, the president in question, proved that post-truth or alternative facts are not just something that this president indulges in when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." So, look at the news media now. Matt Drudge, in the last year, had 11 billion visitors and remains one of the most powerful news sites in the world. Newsweek has shriveled away. And yet, that story was a massive story for everybody. It fed Newsweek at the time, it fed mainstream news, it fed what was then still quite a fledgling thing called 24-hour rolling news. It was good for everybody. We all fed off that story, and the fact that it was also on the internet gave it extra global reach. Now, we're still riding that social media revolution. This weekend at the Sunday Times, we're going to be publishing interviews with Harry Styles of One Direction, Kendall Jenner, great fashion model and member of the Kardashian clan. And internally, I don't mind telling you, we're calling it our Super Social Sunday, because between them they have 100 million Instagram followers. And we want that story, those two interviews, to get out there on the social media, have people talking about the Sunday Times and our content, and we're going to try and sign up a few subscribers on the back of it. It won't be anything like 100 million, but we'll take what we can get. We're going to have people register for free access and sign them up, and we'll get their email addresses. It's a great boon for us. Let's go with it. And it's a great way to get our brand out there in an increasingly global marketplace. So, I don't think the problem is the dissemination of news on social platforms. So is the problem fake news? Well, no, we've already heard from speakers about how fake news has been around forever. Mark Twain said in the 19th century, he said, a lie has traveled halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. So it's true, news spreads faster than ever. But lies and disinformation are not new. It's just called something new: post-truth, alternative facts, truthiness, etc. We had a wonderful example today. I don't know if you've been following the social media, but it turns out that Donald Trump thinks he invented the expression priming the pump. And he said, oh, well, I just came across it. I had this idea about Trumponomics was about priming the pump. Now, this was in an interview with The Economist. This is a win-win for The Economist, which is a very well-established old mainstream publication. But it's got a viral news story at the same time. And we've heard a gentleman in the high-vis jacket and in other places, also talking about accountability. Well, it's been quickly laughed at, debunked all over the world as well. So in the minute it went viral, it also was debunked. And people learned a little bit about where the expression priming the pump comes from and what it means. Great news for The Economist. This is good. So our friend from China talked about accountability as well, and autocratic societies. I mean, in the old Soviet Union, they used to sort of disappear pictures of Trotsky, and how are you going to get back at that? It's very difficult in places where there's not free expression to disseminate news even on social media, but it is possible. Alexei Navalny in Russia has built his following on the basis of social media and internet news. He had a viral video that went looking at what the so-called Dasha, but in actual fact an amazing palace belonging to Medvedev, the former prime minister of Russia. And he was supposed to be a normal guy. Nobody got that rich. It just sort of, only had to look at that video to know that there was corruption on a massive scale there. So even in Russia it's working, it's very helpful. Navalny recently, you can't stop a society being thuggish. He got nearly blinded in one eye. There's some question as to whether he'll regain his sight, but he's been putting pictures of himself out on social media. Incredibly important for those stories to be told. Anyway, now, it's true, as Katie has said, as other people have said, the social media is one big, vast echo chamber. And I know myself that it spreads all kinds of conspiracy theories. I actually wrote about this once and because I sat down in the hairdressers one day, and my lovely, trendy, cool young hairdresser told me that 9/11 was an inside job by the American government, and there couldn't possibly have been any planes. What he didn't know, I was getting quite irate, was I was there as a reporter. I covered 9/11. I saw the planes, I saw the bodies. He was quite shocked to find that he had an eyewitness who could challenge what he was saying. But really, the only point is, he was a young, cool guy who was anti-American. He believed what he wanted to believe. It was just an excuse for him to be anti-American. I'd say the same thing. Why do these stories take off? Why does the birther story about Barack Obama takeoff? It's because there's a section of white America that felt there was something weird and not quite right about having a black man as a president. And the birther conspiracy was a way of saying that. Why was all that chanting about lock her up and Hillary Clinton's a criminal, etc.? Because fundamentally, people didn't really warm to her, and they didn't want her as president, and they were looking for an excuse not to vote for her. And by the same token, the Pussygate tape didn't affect Donald Trump because people were looking for an excuse to vote for him. Well, he's a businessman, he's vulgar, he's brash, etc., but he's a can-do kind of guy. So I don't think that fake news makes all the difference. We've also heard people talk about the canary today, and you know, the sort of alt-left world that people like Jeremy Corbyn are living in. It is entirely possible that a left-wing populist leader might come to power, fueled in part by the social media, but I can tell you now, it's not going to be Jeremy Corbyn. So he's not going to win, and he's going to collide with the real world of true news on June the 8th or 9th? Now, I'd have to check my research for that, but I'm sure someone can tell me because that's the true date. So I don't think the problem is fake news. It's not that dangerous. Social media is a wonderful thing. It tells us all kinds of things. It gives us live reporting. It gave us the neighbor of bin Laden in Atabad live tweeting that, you know, massive, you know, American helicopters have suddenly landed on the roof next door. It's brilliant at telling us live news. I think we still need good journalists to report on and analyze the news and tell us really what's going on. So the question is, who's going to pay for it? We know that the social media has massively expanded the market for news. And the interest in news, I think more people are interested in news than ever before around the globe. It's really helping to educate people despite the rubbish and fake news out there. Demand is off the charts now for news you can trust as a result. The New York Times, in 3 months, got 300,000 extra subscribers just this year. The Wall Street Journal has 1.1 million subscribers. We have 182,000 digital subscribers. That's more than the print sale of The Guardian. People are paying for that, but not enough people are paying for that. The issue is not fake news. The issue is the collapse of the advertising market. This is a totally different subject that could fill all night, but basically Facebook and Google are scooping up about 89% of all new advertising business, and not much of it is trickling down even to digital news. And you can't run a paper like the Sunday Times, which costs £2.50, with foreign correspondents around the world, with people going to interview stars, and even just the basic information of listings and all the rest, without somebody paying for that. £2.50 is very cheap. Advertisers pay on top for that. BBC's lucky they get a subscription automatically, you know, through the license fee. It's like a tax. But people have to put their hand in their pockets and pay for the news they want, whether it's online, digital, on an app, on your phone, or in print. In the end, I'm going to throw this back to you guys. If you want news you can trust, you've got to help pay for it. It's not expensive. The amount of times I get people saying, oh, that looks like an interesting article, but oh, it's behind the paywall. As if it doesn't, you know, but they wouldn't go into a shop and not pay for their bar of chocolate or their can of beer. So it's up to your generation to pay for news that you value. And that way, we've got nothing to fear. Thank you.
I would like to thank Sarah very much for that speech, and indeed if we could have a round of applause for all the speakers that spoke in tonight's debate. I think it's been truly fantastic. Before we move to a vote at the end of this debate, just a quick reminder of events that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks at the Union, indeed before we go sort of on our extended break for the examination period. Coming up very soon, we have Thung Ya Ping, who is a 4 times Olympic gold medalist in ping pong, one of the greatest female and indeed athletes in general that the world has ever seen. Moving on from that, we also have Senator Bernie Sanders appearing at the Union at the very beginning of June, along with dates soon to be announced for Artur Mas, the former Catalonian president, and Gina Miller, the business owner and activist that brought the case against the British government regarding Brexit. However, before those speakers come to speak, the House will now proceed to a division. All those present who are in favour of the motion will leave by the door marked aye, all those against the motion by the door marked nay, and all those abstaining through the door marked simply with the university crest straight through the middle. We'll be in the bar very shortly to announce the result of the motion. If you could all let the speakers in this debate leave before you do, and another massive round of applause for everyone who spoke this evening. Thank you so very much.